Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's guest has lived many lives within the academic world, scholar, teacher, administrator, and now leads one of Canada's most historic universities. Patrick Deane is the principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University. His journey began in South Africa, took him through an academic career that included stops at the University of Toronto, Western, Winnipeg, and McMaster, and ultimately brought him to Kingston, where he became Queen's 14th principal in 2019. In this conversation, we talk about the path from teaching to leadership, the realities of running a university that functions like a small city, and the evolving role of research and undergraduate education. We also explore Queen's relationship with Kingston, its responsibilities around truth and reconciliation, and how institutions help students understand Canada's story in all its complexity. And because no one is only defined by their job, we also talk about life beyond the office, including time spent on a family farm and a deep commitment to caring for animals. I'm pleased to welcome Principal Patrick Deane. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
You have been a professor, you are a principal, and you are a devoted protector of rescued animals. Which of those roles has been the most beneficial for you along the way?
Well, they're all interconnected, of course. I do feel it's all part of a kind of a continuum of activities. Because the other thing you haven't mentioned there is I studied as an undergraduate to be a lawyer, a constitutional and human rights lawyer. And so all of these things are continuous. I think I became an educator partly because I began to see that as a way of making a difference socially that was a different route from the legal route. I mean, when I was growing up in South Africa, the legal route seemed the way to go. In the context of Canada, education's had I suppose, the most promise for me. So that has been key. And I became an administrator the way many of us do, sort of accidentally. I was busily teaching and doing research. And then I remember in my Western years, the department head job opened up and there was a sort of a political reason for someone non-aligned to take it, and I took it. And then I began to see that the educational and research work I was doing as a professor could be really helped by having a certain kind of approach in the leadership of whatever it is, whether the unit is the department or faculty or the university at large. And I think that's how I wound up an administrator. Knew precious little about doing that job at the start and learned, as a lot of people do, just by practice and experience. So that has, in some sense, I feel all of that is it's a continuum of experience, and it's all been driven by very similar values at every phase. The thing you mentioned, of course, too, is the animals. Well, they're not all rescues. These are animals by choice. I do just love animals and have the good fortune to be married to my wife, Sheila, who has an even greater passion for animals than I do. So it's been natural to expand one's life in that direction. I suppose, if I pause and think how that ties into the other stuff. I think you don't realize this when you're younger, of course, but there is, one's existence on the planet has multiple dimensions, and the natural world is a key part of that, and your relationship with it is a key part of that. Mm-hmm. So I'd say that as I've edged into a more thoughtful relationship with the natural world and with the environment, I've been led there by my love of the animals. Now I find I'm in I'm still there with the animals, but I'm in a different place. COVID also altered my relationship with the natural world in one way or another. I think other people have had this experience too, partly because one was forced to find meaning and companionship, and in that solitude in nature. So that's how it all hangs together, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the beginning. I'm always interested in asking someone why they pick a particular discipline to study when they go to university.
Right.
Yours was English. What is it about English?
Oh, well, I love language. And I also understand that in a way, what you're doing the whole time is making or deciphering text. I just constructed a narrative for you about the growth of my career. That's a narrative. It could be a different one. And probably if I were weighing different considerations, it would have been a different narrative. So I think there's something about language and the processes of making art with language and experiencing language as created and assembled by other people that's fascinating and very directly useful in navigating your way in life. There was a fellow from the University of Toronto who was doing a PhD recently on university presidents. And he asked if he could come and talk to me about it. And he asked me the very question you just asked. Although he phrased it a different way. He said, what is it about your academic training that has best equipped you to be a university president? And I had to say, well, it is the study of literature. Mm-hmm. He looked entirely uncomprehending at this. But I believe it. I mean, I think, reading for nuance is what you have to do with people, with situations. You have to understand what's at stake in a language act. And I don't know that I was ever a kind of an arts for art's sake, pure lover of literature. I've always loved it. But it's that intersection between the social occasion and the psychological occasion of making and experiencing art and the kind of the broader social context of it that's interested me. And it's perennially interesting, right? I mean, mm-hmm. my period is the 1930s, and amongst the people I work on is George Orwell. I'm interested in the relationship of literature and politics in Britain in that period. And it's very interesting how relevant those writers, and Orwell in particular, have become.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, you grew up in South Africa. You did your undergraduate degree there and then came here to do some graduate work. And at some point you decided to stay. What was it about Canada that attracted you or helped you make that decision?
I'm the child of a Canadian mother. My parents met in Welland, Ontario in 1947 when my father, a South African, came to Canada to learn a bit about the steel he was importing from this country. And he met my mother in Welland, and they got married and I think in 40, I want to say it's 47 or 48, they went back to South Africa where they raised me and my brother. I left left South Africa, I should say, in January of 1979. And I'm not sure. This is a lengthy way of answering your question, but I'm not sure I ever intended going back. I left with a one-way ticket. Mm-hmm. I know that. My excuse was I didn't know when I'd be coming back. But I left with a one-way ticket, and I also left with a Canadian passport, which, thanks to Joe Clark, I had through my mother.
Yeah.
And there's a complex history to this, which I could talk about. But for a young white guy of my generation in South Africa, it was not clear at that time what one's role would or should mm-hmm. be in the liberation of the country.
Yeah.
I ostensibly, what I said to myself at the time, here we're getting back to the narratives you tell yourself, but what I told myself at the time was I needed to leave the country in order to understand my place in it.
Makes sense, yeah.
Now, the fact that I never went back is sort of the answer. I think that I realized I had no place in it, which I'm not sure is true. But I think in the interim, the attraction of education, the quality of Canada as a place to live, spoke to what I really felt I needed personally, and also the kind of context in which I thought I could actually find myself and make a difference of some sort.
Mm-hmm. For those people who may not be familiar with the academic routine, if you will, you spent time after you became a professor at the University of Toronto, Western, University of Winnipeg, which you mentioned, a McMaster, and Queen's. Is that type of moving around something that's typical of academics?
It is, yeah. I think there is a time when it was much more common. I think in the 60s and 70s there was a lot of mobility amongst academics, partly because there was a lot of employment to be had. By the time I finished my PhD, which would have been the early 80s, the job market was not so great, and so you moved around a lot, partly because you were looking for employment, not so much that you were moving around to take advantage of employment at different places. So that sort of began the period in which your apprenticeship, if you like, was a sessional position, then a contract position somewhere else, then another contract position somewhere else, and then, if you were fortunate, as I was, a tenure track position would open up, and you would then move into the whole promotion and tenure phase. So I think that movement was at the time natural. It differs by institution, though, you know. I mean, I think here at Queen's we have quite a lot of people who've graduated from here, stayed here, continue to teach here, and do very well. When I was finishing my PhD, the wisdom supposedly was that the best thing you could do is move away. You know, you should always be going to some different place. I've never really believed that either of those is absolute truth. I think you make the career you can based on your own circumstances and what opportunities present themselves. I feel very fortunate about it, though. I remember getting the call offering me the position at the University of Toronto when my daughter was just, I want to say she was just about 6 months, living in a townhouse in London, Ontario, and on Sunday afternoon, late in the summer, got this phone call saying would I be interested in a contract position at the U of T. And it was a wonderful experience and the beginning of that process.
And all of these institutions would have similarities, but they would also have differences in the way they do things.
Oh, yeah. I suppose the most different of the places I've been was the University of Winnipeg, which is primarily an undergrad institution. And that was interesting too, in that was the beginning of my movement as an administrator. So for the other moves, say from Western to Toronto, Toronto back to Western, those were very much driven by the opportunities available on the kind of the academic ladder. But I went to Winnipeg as a vice president academic, and then within 2 years found myself acting president, which was a really extraordinary experience, given that I'd been a simple department head at Western 3 years before that. And I learned a lot. It was very interesting, and it got me excited about what it means to do these kinds of jobs.
Now, you came to Queen's at one point, and you left and went to Western? Mac.
Yeah.
And then you came back to Queen's to take on the job that you have now. So that was 2019.
Yeah.
So right. You were succeeding Daniel Wolf as principal. What stood out at that particular point when you were stepping into that role at Queen's?
Oh, it's an interesting question. Well, so remember I had left in 2010 to go to Mac, and we'd done some important academic innovations. The university was struggling with a couple of issues. I think we were struggling to build our research capacity. We had struggled a bit with equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, and Kingston was a different place, in those years running up to 2010. And I left feeling as though I had quite a lot of unfinished business here, things I thought we needed to do, things that would be critical to the future health and success of the institution. In the 9 years I was away at Mac, I had the privilege of watching Queen's from the outside, which is it's a remarkable thing to be able to do when you've had one of these roles in a place like this, then to step out. And Daniel and I were good friends and still are, so he and I would talk about the sector and our two institutions quite a lot. I think by 2018, when I was feeling that by then I'd done 8 years at Mac, and I think that is, somewhere between 8 and 10 years is the kind of the sweet spot for people doing these jobs. I'd begun to think, well, what's the next thing? And my perception was that a lot of progress had been made here at Queen's. We're still struggling with the research issue, but that's an honest kind of a problem to have because it's just related to our size. But we had made remarkable progress on equity issues, diversity issues, and I think the kind of the national reputation of the institution on that issue was improving. I also had, incredibly fond memories of Queen's. It is a lovely place to work. It's the most unusual Canadian institution. Of all of them I've worked in, it has the most unique culture. So the other thing to say is that the situation of universities in the province it's never been as difficult as it is now. And in 2019, one could begin to see the beginnings of that. So I've done this work long enough to know I have benefits I can bring, or at least some things I can bring. And I also have a passion for these places and their success.
I've been told that there's a certain level of power and responsibility that's been shared, or is described as being shared by three people here at Queen's. One is the Chancellor, who happens to be Sheila Rogers.
Yep.
The second is the Rector, who happens to be Nikki Boychuk-Hill,
Yep.
and you.
Yep.
And I am looking to get some sort of sense as to how that relationship works in practice and how do the roles differ.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind that I have spoken and done one of these episodes with Nikki.
Yeah, I know you have. I mentioned that Queen's is unique, and this is one of the ways in which we are unique. All Canadian universities have a chancellor. Almost none have a chancellor as heavily integrated with the life of the university as Queen's chancellor is. She serves on all the board committees. She's a key player. She chairs the search committee for the principal and those sorts of things. So the Chancellor is very much integrated with the life of the university here in a way that's less true of other institutions, where they tend to be more of a figurehead presiding over convocation. At the same time, though, it is still the titular head of the institution without any operational responsibilities other than those specified ones. And it is historically not a remunerated position. I would say, what's not written down is the Chancellor is hugely influential. For the person who sits in this office, the principal, the Chancellor is an incredibly important confidant and advisor. Partly because the Chancellor is, to some extent, outside of the power structure, at the top of the power structure, but also outside of its day-to-day operation. Yeah. So it's a very important role, and I've been very privileged to work with Jim Leach and Marie Sinclair, and now Sheila in that role. All wonderful in quite different ways. The Rector is a very unique position. So the antecedent for it is at the University of Edinburgh, where they have a Rector. who's actually not a student. It's usually an alumnus who holds that role. But the function is more or less the same at Edinburgh, in the sense that this is an elected person whose job it is to represent the interests of students to the administration. And here we've had a student in that role. I think Nikki and I did talk about the precise date for this, but I think it's sometime in the 60s that the rector became permanently a student. I think it's a wonderful role. I've had extraordinarily good relationships with many rectors, both when I was here before and since I came back in 2019. And it's hugely helpful to have someone that senior in the institution who is linked in to what's going on at the student level, and not student government in the normal sense, important though those folks are too. And of course the rector serves like the Chancellor on the board and on board committees and things of that sort, so has a perspective on the administration of the institution that's unique among students. It really works. Mm-hmm. It's a unique Queen's phenomenon, as I say, and yet it's very good. From the point of view of the person who sits where I do, both of those positions are a real asset.
Mm. As principal, you're effectively the CEO of the university, and responsibility functions in a manner that's similar to a small city. Given the size of Queen's and the fact that there's 34,000 students and 130,000 alumni worldwide, which is a lot more than was here when I was a student in the early 70s. I think there were about 10,000 students here at that particular point. How do you keep perspective with that particular scale, the number of students and alumni, as CEO?
It's a really important question, that, Dave. I think universities have grown somewhat unfortunately. So they have grown of necessity because of the way in which higher education is funded in this province. They've grown simply to keep their finances in order. I mean, sometimes grown deliberately for academic reasons. Build extra programs or specific new programs, you have extra students. But almost all universities now find themselves somewhat bigger than they ideally would want to be. And I would say, yes, so back in the 70s, you wouldn't have dreamed this place could be the size it is now, and there it is. And the truth is that does place a tremendous strain on the ability of the person who sits where I do to meaningfully understand what's going on in the day-to-day lives of students, even, you might say, even in the day-to-day lives of faculty members, right? So it is a much more remote perspective than it should be. In that evolution from the 1970s till now, we've created the position of provost. And that was intended to establish administrative oversight that was closer to the nuts and bolts of operations than the principal could any longer expect to have. And I think that model does work well. So the provost does have a much more intimate knowledge of the day-to-day workings of the place. But given the scale of the institution, even he is not privy to the day-to-day experience of being at Queen's that would have been the case back when you were a student here. Mm-hmm. I mean, people talk about this, it's an ugly phrase, but people do talk about the massification of higher education, that it's become this operation that's way bigger than it should be. And I think it is. I mean, it would be foolish to pretend that it's better to educate people in a room with 500 students in a single lecture and 6 TAs than in a much smaller room with 30 students and one professor. I mean, no, you can do things, and I think lots of instructors find very good ways of being effective at scale. But But if one had one's choice, that's not necessarily what you do. I mean, speaking as an educator, I think one sometimes educates despite the circumstances rather than in kind of harmony with them.
Right.
And so, I mean, what goes for the experience of being an educator goes for the experience of being an administrator, right? I mean, what's happened as universities have gotten bigger is that roles like mine have become, the uncharitable word people would use for them is corporate, that there has been an expansion of administrative structures in universities, and I think that is true. I don't think there's any other way of running these places other than by creating some positions of that sort and delegating authority. But at the same time, I would be absolutely honest and just say every millimeter that opens up between you and the experience on the ground is a loss. We spend our time, I use this phrase despite me, we spend our time trying to make the experience here enriching and wonderful and humane, despite the fact that the circumstances militate against it.
You talk about that millimeter that opens up. And one of my memories from my time here at Queen's was the ability for the university to take what I thought was a really small piece of property and put a decent-sized building on it and do it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And it's that whole business of trying to reduce the millimeters or keep them closer, and I understand what's going on there. There's a couple of things, and you've already alluded to them. One of them is research. And I read somewhere where the university about 15 years ago joined a network that emphasizes the link between research excellence and undergraduate teaching. And why do you think that link is important?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important because I think part of the excitement of learning at this level is inseparable from the excitement of discovery. I mean, I reflect only on my own undergrad years. You know, I remember the moment when the light came on, studying some impenetrable text, and I did research on it, and I still wasn't getting anywhere. And then I realized it's the questions I'm asking. I'm asking the wrong questions about this. In other words, comprehension is all about questions, instinctively settling on the right ones to ask and then finding the answers to them. So for me, the possibility of doing this kind of work arose precisely from that discovery. So I do believe, yes, there's learning that can occur in which you are just on the receiving end of information. And there's nothing wrong with that if that is all you're needing. But I think the purpose of a university is to infuse people with the ability to continue to educate themselves and to grow as human beings. And so our job is really to give people the tools for intellectual growth rather than just the kind of the counters that you produce as evidence that you've been trained as a lawyer, for example. So that's why I do think higher education, certainly in an institution that would lay claim to the kind of excellence we do, needs to occur in the context of the research enterprise, which doesn't mean that every undergrad is studying neutrinos, for example. But it is important that the professor who teaches you is excited about ideas, excited about their field, and driven by that same passion to ask the right questions and find the right answers to them. So for me, that's why these two things are connected and should be connected if a university is to be worthy of the name. I would say, though, there are many different forms this can take. Not everybody in the institution who's teaching needs to be a Nobel Prize winner. And there are many ways in which the institution-wide commitment to research can benefit undergrads, even if they're not in a lab, say, with a leading researcher. So I think you do well to be open to the multiple forms this can take. The principle, though, is one I'd want to stick to, which is, why come to Queen's? You come to Queen's because the faculty members are high-achieving, very smart people at the front of their discipline. That just needs to be the case. And then the challenge actually is to make sure then that the experience properly shows the impact of that research presence. Mm-hmm. And this gets you to the massification issue, which is it possible to, right? Even if you've got a Nobel Prize winning researcher at the front of the room, if you've got 400 students in the room, how meaningful is the dialogue they can have with that research mind? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
For those who live outside the country, you may not be aware that restrictions have been put on international student enrollment. And I wonder how that impacts the university here, academically, financially, culturally.
Well, it has a very damaging impact here, as it does at every other university in the country. I'll put to one side the political policy considerations that led the government to impose it, because there are all kinds of other considerations there. The question is really, what's the impact on universities of these caps? I'll start with the cultural and the intellectual. This is, in my view, the most serious area of impact. I mean, we do like to present ourselves as a global institution. We're not as global as we might wish to be, or as though we might hope we are. And so it needs to be a critical project for Queen's to work diligently to internationalize itself. And we have a very good global engagement plan that is helping move us in that direction. Key to it is two things. One, sending our students abroad and making sure our faculty are connected internationally. The latter is not such an issue. I mean, faculty members typically do that. They do see themselves as part of a global network in their field. And a decent proportion of our students do go abroad. In some programs, it's a requirement that they do so. So that's all good. The key, though, is international students coming here, because the campus does not become internationalized unless the world is here alongside Canadian students. And Canadian universities have, except with a few notable exceptions, have not been great at internationalizing themselves in that way. I think of, driven by much less admirable motives, Australian universities, huge numbers of international students in the early 2000s. We came slow to it. I would say a healthy percentage population of the undergrad student body international should be about 20%, just for the cultural benefit that domestic Canadian students would derive, as well as those students here as well. Between 20 and 30, I would say, is where you want to be if you want to position yourself as a university of the world. When I came here in 2019, I think we were at about, I want to say about 15, 16%. Then COVID dramatically altered patterns of international student mobility. Then the impact of the differential charges being levied on these students had an impact. And then most recently, the federal government's caps have had another impact. So Our international student numbers at the undergrad level are far below where they should be. And we definitely need, for the academic mission of the institution, for the cultural benefit of our domestic students, we need to drive that number up. Mm-hmm. In the same way, we need to be facilitating the international connections of our faculty members and welcoming international faculty members here on visiting fellowships and things like that. We need to do all of that. Sadly, though, the impact of the federal government's decision has been to damage the national brand in a way that I don't think they understand will be easily healed. My prediction would be that even if the caps were to be lifted, it would be 10 years before the country could begin to plausibly present itself as a place that is welcoming to international students. Mm-hmm. Because the way in which the country is perceived, sadly, is that international students are no longer welcome here. That's not true at the universities. The universities do welcome them. But our government has telegraphed a message to the world that is, I think, a really unfortunate one.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that changing anytime soon?
I don't know. I can't speak for government and the policy considerations. I mean, I'm in the sector, but if I were to look at it and objectively assess the importance to the Canadian economy of a healthy number of international students being here and the benefits to the country of a significant proportion of those students sticking around and contributing to the economy on a longer-term basis, I would regard this as, potentially the loss of a whole industry to the country that will be damaging. The government has options it has to weigh, and I know, it's obvious to everyone that this issue's been caught up in the crisis about housing, but it's most unfortunate.
Let's talk a little bit about housing. That was my next question,
Sure.
And you led into it very nicely. When I first moved here as a teenager, and this goes back a number of years before I started at Queen's, I would drive downtown Kingston and drive down Princess Street, which is the main drag here in town, and note the various buildings that were there. And lately, when I'm driving down Princess Street, I do not recognize the area at all because there are a lot of what I consider to be major-sized apartment buildings, particularly just north of the campus. I assume most of those would have been built with respect to housing students. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what kind of interplay you have with builders who come to the community, who are already here in the community, in terms of what, do they come to you and ask you about needs in terms of housing or that sort of thing?
There are occasional conversations between private sector developers and plans they might have for the university district. There is no close coordination of the university with those developers. I mean, we typically think of, we have a housing guarantee that we make to first-year students, and we want to make sure we, on our own properties, can house a certain number of our students. And obviously, we own some houses in the district. Beyond that, I don't know quite how to put this. I would say that developers see the opportunities that they see and build accordingly. They don't do so in partnership with the university. They do so on their own because of a need they perceive. It's very complex, and I'm very sympathetic to members of the community who see the erosion of the kind of residential quality of the neighborhood, the loss of facilities that come from neighborhoods being essentially turned into kind of largely student housing areas. So I'm very sympathetic to that. It is unfortunately one of the challenges we have of having a university of our size in a city of our size. Mm-hmm. I do welcome dialogue with the city about ways of minimizing the detrimental effects of this and maximizing some of the more positive initiatives that are undertaken. And once or twice there are developers who do come up with an idea that we might all agree could be very useful. It's a complex question. I think we're all committed to the same goal, which is that the students should be equitably housed and healthfully housed, but that the quality of the city for the people who live here, who are not students who live here year-round, should not be harmed by that. So, we need to kind of ameliorate whatever harms get done by the concentration of people in this part of the city. And I think work both with the city and developers and the neighborhood to come up with better solutions. I feel very positively right now about the openness of the dialogue with the city and the university, and I think we can all identify, frankly, the problems that are in place, and we can talk in a reasonably constructive way about finding solutions to them.
This particular question, I've been thinking about how to phrase it properly, and so I'll just put it out the way I've written it. We can chat about it. For listeners outside Canada, back in 2008 to 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented the lasting impacts of the residential school system on Indigenous students and their families. From your perspective as a principal, what responsibility does a university like Queen's have in helping students understand the importance of that report? And also, how do you ensure it is taught as a vital part of Canada's broader and ongoing story?
This is a critical issue for the whole country, and it therefore has to be a critical issue for institutions like ours. Mm-hmm. I think since the publication of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and since the delivery of our own internal Truth and Reconciliation report, I think considerable progress has been made. You specifically ask about the role institutions like this should play in the raising of consciousness of this history across the country. And I do think that is really important. I think that's a fundamental responsibility institutions like this have. There's been an ongoing discussion, I know, going back to Daniel's time, but about since I've been back too, about how that should be done, right? I mean, sometimes it's proposed that every student should be required to take a course that explores these issues. I can see the value of that. I've also heard proponents of Indigenous issues say, no, compelling people to take a course doesn't actually achieve what you want. It's, in fact, fostering in meaningful ways an understanding of that history and of Indigenous cultures that we need to do. And that drives you in the direction of curriculum and Indigenous content in courses. This is sometimes spoken of as decolonizing the curriculum too. I think there's a lot to be done still there. I mean, in some disciplines which are resolutely Western in their epistemology, that is a more challenging thing to do than in others. But that is one way in which you can do it, which is to say you allow alterations to even the ways of thinking about knowledge that have been enshrined in universities under the influence of Indigenous ways of knowing. I suppose my answer to this question is there is no single act that one can embark on. It has to be, we have to change ourselves in the first instance. It's easy to use the phrase decolonizing the university. It's much harder in practice to say what that looks like. Mm-hmm. Because these places are fundamentally Western in their conception and operation. And so you have to be open to an alteration in those things. But work, persists in that area, and we will get there. On the curricular side, yes, altering the curriculum to recognise Indigenous history and the history of the residential schools, that is important. Raising the visibility of these things on campus too. I think the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation has each year drawn a larger crowd here on campus and has had a much broader impact on our operations. But however, that can't be confined to one day. It's got to be an ongoing year-round approach. So I do think this remains an unsolved problem on which we are making some progress. But I think, everyone is aware of how many of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have not been followed through on. And I know we've internally, we published a number of reports on our progress on the internal Truth and Reconciliation Committee's recommendations. The further you go, the more difficult the actions you have to take are, and so the slower the progress, I would say.
Is there a chance that we may lose some of that history? I'm thinking of individuals who made wrong decisions back in history of this country, but also made some good decisions about the country as a whole. Do you think we might have a problem with losing some of that history and the good accomplishments that some of these people made?
Chancellor Sinclair Iban, who was my most trusted advisor on these issues, used to talk about this in a very helpful way. He was not in favor of the elimination of history or the rewriting of history. He used to just talk about the need to contextualize it. And I think, it has to be possible for a single, well, we know it is possible because it occurs in human beings. Individuals can, in some of their actions, be a positive influence on the evolution of a society, and in other opinions they may hold, and actions they might take be utterly reprehensible. I'm not sure the point is to sit in judgment on one or the other of those things. I think what's important is to be clear on the values one wishes to see continued, to offer critique of the past and lay out a positive and constructive way for the future. I don't know if you know, but it's now currently under review, but we have a policy on the revocation of honorary degrees. And the policy as it stands now, although it may well change, is that we do not revoke honorary degrees from deceased individuals. We may do so from people who are still alive who are revealed to have been guilty of some kind of criminal activity. But what we do allow in the case of deceased individuals is for the university to issue a statement. In this case, it's the Senate will issue a statement about, in particular, about the conferring of an honorary degree upon, in the case I'm thinking of is Duncan Campbell Scott. So that is to do what Chancellor Sinclair used to talk about, which is to say, provide a context within which that person's actions can be understood, but also can be subject to evaluation. I think, Canadian history is complicated in this way, but so too are all national histories. And I think one has to be very clear on the ethical path forward. But it doesn't follow that involves a negation of a past you judge to be unethical. It was, and it still is.
Yep. Let me get you out of the office here and head back to the farm.
Right.
You told me before we started recording that this is not the only farm you've ever had. You've had farms in different places.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in you telling the story again about going from farm to farm. And as you've accumulated various four-legged residents, that you had to move those four-legged residents, I would imagine, would not be an easy job.
No. Yeah, well, it's been very interesting, and I probably need to also include my children in this story because, the ability of a family to take on a farm depends on the size of the family and the number of eager hands ready to help out. The first thing I'd say about the farms is that I wasn't born on a farm. I'm a city guy, so it was not an easy thing for me to think about doing when we first did it. But I was convinced by the family that we needed to. We had all these horses, so we needed to have them with us. And of course, I was convinced by the fact that if you added up the boarding charges for the horses, it exceeded the size of the mortgage. So it made perfect economical sense. So it's, the first farm was just on the edge of Birds Hill Park, north of Winnipeg. I would say a somewhat foolhardy move for the first farm you have to be north of Winnipeg, an hour north of Winnipeg it was. During a Winnipeg winter, that we learned a lot very quickly about keeping livestock at that temperature. But we came to love it. And then this is where the numbers of animals started to grow. And so
it's not just horses.
It started as horses, then sheep joined, and there were chickens added, then there were goats added as we moved from place to place. So the numbers of animals has grown, although I would say where we are now it's declining somewhat because we don't eat any of our animals, and so we basically give them a nice life until they come to the end of their lives. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a retirement farm.
Now, do you work the farm or just take care of the animals?
We take care of the animals and we grow hay to
Okay.
feed them. And my neighbor John helps us with the haying and all of that stuff. But the almost at the time the operation was at its largest, our kids entered university-going age. So ironically, we were at our largest in terms of numbers of animals after both kids had moved on. So my son now lives in Winnipeg, my daughter in Vermont, and
after the hands had left the farm.
the hands left the farm, and she and I were left with them. I've loved it. I can't imagine living anywhere else, actually, and I do find one derives a lot of emotional pleasure from being around animals, and it's also highly educational. So, yeah.
What does it do for you when you leave the office after a particularly difficult day?
Oh, well, what's fabulous about the farm is it's non-negotiable. Animals need to be fed. Dogs need to be walked. There's 6 border collies on the farm. So, however I feel, even if I'm cheesed off after a day in the office and if things niggling away at me, when I get out of the car at the other end, well, I don't really have any choice, just have to put them to one side.
Yeah.
And I think that is extremely therapeutic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's and it's by the same token, it's nice to begin the day with them as well.
Now, when you retire, is farming still something that you would continue to do as it sits now?
I would want to. I mean, I think it's the scale is not right. I mean, I think when I will reach an age when the dogs are fine. Don't need all the sheep and goats, but in a way, the question's moot because we will keep them until they aren't there.
Yeah. And
we are on what my wife and I call our attrition mission. So the number doesn't increase. It's sort of a race between our own progressive decrepitude and the demands of the animals declining.
Mm-hmm.
But it is very nice. And I'm a great lover of rural life. I find our community up around Harrismith is really lovely and sort of tight, mutually supportive community.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, as a Kingston resident and a graduate of Queen's, I appreciate the role the university plays in our community. I know yours is not an easy job, and I'm grateful for all the work that you put into it. Thank you for your time today.
Hey, thanks.
All the best.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
That was my conversation with Patrick Deane, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University. My thanks to Principal Deane for his time and insight. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and consider rating and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others discover the show. This episode was recorded in January of 2026. I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.